At its height in 1986, a single factory complex on Long Island, New York, employed 23,000 people, occupied 6 million square feet of industrial floor space, and produced some of the most lethal aircraft ever to take flight from the deck of an American warship. Walk through the gates of Bethpage in 1965 and you would step into a world that operated on its own rules. Shift whistles echoing across a campus that stretched across 105 acres. Machine shops running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Men and women in coveralls assembling naval fighters with the same quiet pride a craftsman might bring to a fine piece of furniture, except the final product could exceed twice the speed of sound. This was the Grumman Iron Works. That is what the Navy called it. Not a nickname born of marketing, but of earned reputation. Grumman aircraft came back from battles that should have destroyed them. Pilots climbed out of cockpits riddled with Japanese cannon fire, looked at their battered machines, and walked away whole. The planes were that indestructible. The numbers behind this factory defy easy comprehension. 12,275 Hellcat fighters produced in 30 months during World War II. 6 spacecraft that touched the surface of the moon, each one bearing a nameplate that read, "Made in Bethpage, New York." 712 F-14 Tomcat interceptors that guarded American carrier battle groups through the coldest years of the Cold War. Then something went catastrophically wrong. Not in a single day, not in a single decision, but across a decade of shrinking contracts, vanishing enemies, and a world that no longer needed what Grumman built with such ferocious dedication. Today the buildings still stand. Office workers move through corridors where engineers once wrestled with the problem of landing human beings on the moon. Film crews set up cameras in hangars where the most feared naval fighter in American history once took shape beneath fluorescent lights. So how does an empire this powerful disappear? How does a company that helped win a world war and put astronauts on the moon end up absorbed, relocated, and slowly erased from the community it built for 65 years? The answer is a story about genius, about loyalty, about the brutal arithmetic of peace, and about what happens when the world you were built to serve stops needing you. Welcome inside the Grumman factory, where the most capable aviation empire in American history was born in a broken-down garage, rose to touch the stars, and fell silent in the shadow of the very peace it helped create. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. These stories take a lot of research, and every bit of support helps us keep bringing them to you. January 2nd, 1930. Baldwin, New York. The building had broken windows. 3 feet of dead leaves blanketed the floor. It had once been an automobile showroom, then a failed aircraft workshop under the name Cox-Clemin Aircraft Company, and now it sat abandoned on a side street in a quiet Long Island town. 6 men stood inside it on the second day of the new decade and decided it was good enough to start a company. Leroy Randall Grumman was 35 years old. He had been born in Huntington, New York, in 1895, the son of a carriage shop owner. From the time he was a teenager, he believed that the aeroplane would represent one of the greatest triumphs of human civilization over nature. He said as much in his high school graduation address in 1911, which is the sort of statement that tends to look either foolish or prophetic in hindsight. In Grumman's case, it was prophetic. He graduated from Cornell University with a degree in mechanical engineering in 1916, served as a naval aviator in the Great War, and spent the 1920s rising through the ranks at the Loaning Aeronautical Engineering Corporation in New York City, becoming its factory manager and then general manager. He was good at almost everything: engineering, problem-solving, managing people, and understanding what the Navy needed before the Navy fully understood it themselves. When Keystone Aircraft Corporation purchased Loaning in 1929 and ordered the entire operation relocated to Bristol, Pennsylvania, Grumman refused to leave Long Island. He was joined by 3 fellow Loaning engineers, Jake Swerble, William Schwendler, and Edmund Ward Poor, who felt the same way. Grumman mortgaged his house for $16,950. Swerbel's mother borrowed $6,000 from her employers. Together, they scraped together enough capital to register their corporation on December 6, 1929, and open for business the following January. The early days were humbling. To keep the lights on, the new Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation welded aluminum tubing into truck body frames for commercial vehicles. It was not glamorous work, but it paid the bills while the founders chased the contracts they actually wanted, contracts with the United States Navy. Grumman had an instinct for what naval aircraft required: planes that could survive the brutal violence of carrier landings, planes that could fold their wings to fit on crowded carrier decks, planes that could take punishment and still bring their pilots home. These were not abstract ideals. These were engineering problems, and Leroy Grumman was an engineer above all else. In 1930, Grumman secured its first naval contract for retractable floats with landing gear for Navy seaplanes. It was a small contract. It was a beginning. 1931, Curtis Field, Valley Stream, New York. The company had outgrown the Baldwin Garage faster than anyone anticipated. By 1931, it had moved into hangar space at Curtis Field in Valley Stream, then to Fairchild Field in Farmingdale by 1932, following a trail of expanding ambition up through the towns of Long Island. Each move represented more workers, more contracts, more aircraft rolling out the doors. Rear Admiral John S. McCain, uncle of the future senator, would later say that the name Grumman on an aircraft held the same meaning for the Navy that the word sterling held for silver. That reputation was not handed to the company. It was engineered into every aircraft Grumman produced, one design decision at a time. The Grumman FF-1, delivered to the Navy in 1932, became the first naval aircraft with a fully retractable landing gear, a feature that reduced aerodynamic drag and gave it a meaningful speed advantage over its contemporaries. The follow-on designs, the F-2F and F-3F, continued the evolutionary process. Each aircraft was faster, more maneuverable, more capable than the last, and each one carried the unmistakable Grumman signature of structural robustness. These planes did not fall apart when stressed. They were overbuilt by design, because Leroy Grumman believed that a pilot's life was worth more than a few £100 of saved weight. In 1936, the company made its most consequential move. A local Bethpage businessman named Al Doring persuaded Grumman to relocate his expanding operation to a patch of Long Island farmland, polo grounds belonging to the Central Park Hunt Club, in the hamlet of Bethpage in Nassau County. Grumman and his partners purchased the land and built a new factory and airfield directly on the property. Bethpage would define the Grumman story from that day forward. The factory opened on the new site in 1936. Over the next 2 decades, it would grow from a single building surrounded by farmland into one of the most extraordinary industrial complexes in the Western world. By the fall of 1941, Grumman employed approximately 6,500 workers at Bethpage. The company was profitable. Its reputation with the Navy was unrivaled, and its engineers were already at work on the aircraft that would make the name Grumman synonymous with American naval air power during the most devastating conflict the world had ever known. War was coming. The Iron Works was ready. December 8, 1941, Bethpage, New York. The day after Japanese aircraft attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, the Grumman factory complex did not slow down. It accelerated. Within weeks, production lines that had been running in single shifts stretched into 2, then 3. Workers poured into Bethpage from across Long Island. Farmers left their fields. Housewives applied for factory positions. The workforce that had numbered 6,500 in the autumn grew toward 25,000 by September 1943. The aircraft that put Grumman on the historical record permanently was the F-6F Hellcat. Conceived in mid-1941 as an evolution of the earlier F-4F Wildcat, The Hellcat went from drawing board to first flight in June 1942, and from first flight to frontline combat deployment in August 1943, a span of barely 18 months. In an era before computer-aided design, before automated production lines, before most of the tools modern engineers take for granted, this was an astonishing achievement. What the Hellcat did to Japanese naval aviation in the Pacific is almost impossible to overstate. Grumman's Bethpage Plant No. 3 produced 12,275 Hellcats over 30 months, with much of the factory still being built around the workers assembling the first aircraft inside it. Hellcat pilots achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against enemy aircraft. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, 19 Japanese planes were shot down. The aircraft accounted for 75% of all United States Navy aerial victories in the Pacific theater. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcat pilots destroyed more than 350 Japanese aircraft in a single day. In March 1945 alone, Grumman's Bethpage facility set a wartime production record when it delivered 664 aircraft in a single month. One factory, 1 month, 664 warplanes. That is the output of a nation at full industrial fury, compressed into a single address on a Long Island street. The Navy awarded Grumman its Production Excellence Award, the Navy E, 5 consecutive times. No other contractor matched that record. The Iron Works had not just delivered aircraft, it had delivered victory. But the war was ending, and no one at Bethpage yet understood what peace would cost them. 1947. Bethpage, New York. The piston engine era was dying. Jet aircraft were the future of military aviation, and every major manufacturer in America understood it. The question was not whether to make the transition, but whether a company built around propeller-driven naval fighters could make it fast enough and well enough to remain the Navy's preferred supplier. Grumman made the jump. The F-9F Panther, the company's first jet aircraft, flew in November 1947 and entered Navy service in 1949. It was not the fastest jet in the world. It was not the most technically advanced, but it was characteristically Grumman, rugged, reliable, easy to maintain, and well suited to the specific demands of carrier operations. Navy pilots trusted it because they had learned to trust what came out of Bethpage. The Panther's upgraded sibling, the F-9F Cougar, introduced swept wings and flew in 1951. The F-11 Tiger followed in 1954. Through the 1950s, the company methodically worked its way through the challenges of jet propulsion and supersonic flight, never rushing, never gambling the company's reputation on an aircraft that was not ready. Leroy Grumman's core engineering philosophy, build it right, build it strong, make it simple where possible, survived the transition from pistons to jets without modification. During the same period, Grumman built the Gulfstream I turboprop business aircraft, first flown in 1958. It was a deliberate move into civilian markets, a hedge against the cyclical nature of military procurement. The Gulfstream I found customers among corporations, government agencies, and regional airlines. It was followed by the Gulfstream II jet in 1966. Both aircraft were excellent products. Both demonstrated that Grumman could build for markets beyond the Navy. By the late 1950s, the company's workforce had climbed back toward 14,000 employees at Bethpage after the post-war drawdown, and revenues were rising steadily. In 1957, the year the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit and shocked the Western world, a small team of Grumman engineers began studying a question that seemed impossibly ambitious. Could Grumman build a vehicle capable of landing human beings on the surface of the moon?
They believed it could. The roulette wheel, as one Grumman executive would later write, had stopped on their number.
What came next would make Bethpage famous the world over. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We're just getting to the part of this story where everything changes. Do not go anywhere. November 7th, 1962, Bethpage, New York. NASA announced its decision. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had been selected as the prime contractor for the Apollo Lunar Module, the spacecraft that would carry 2 American astronauts from lunar orbit down to the surface of the Moon and return them safely back to the command module orbiting above. The contract was officially signed on January 14, 1963. The expected cost was in the neighborhood of $350 million. The actual final cost, adjusted for inflation into 2016 dollars, would reach $21.65 billion. No vehicle remotely like the lunar module had ever been built. It would operate exclusively in the vacuum of space, which meant it needed no aerodynamic shaping, no streamlining, no wings. It was designed purely for function, a spider-legged, foil-wrapped machine of breathtaking fragility that had to work perfectly every single time, because there was no rescue if it failed. Thomas J. Kelly, the Grumman engineer who became known as the father of the lunar module, later wrote that the engineers at Bethpage understood from the beginning that they were building the most unforgiving spacecraft in the history of human exploration. The workforce that assembled around the lunar module program swelled toward 30,000 employees company-wide, numbers not seen since the peak of World War II production. The assembly took place in a pressurized, climate-controlled clean room at Bethpage, large enough to hold 3 complete lunar modules simultaneously. 60-hour work weeks were standard. Astronauts were regular visitors to the factory floor, checking systems, meeting the workers who were building the machines that would carry them to another world. Grumman built 13 lunar modules in all. 6 of them successfully landed on the Moon between July 1969 and December 1972. The 7th served as a lifeboat during the near disaster of Apollo 13 in April 1970, when an oxygen tank explosion crippled the command module and the crew crawled into the Grumman-built craft, depended on its systems, and rode it home alive. Each descent stage of the 6 landing missions remains on the lunar surface today. Each one carries a nameplate. The nameplate reads, "Made in Bethpage, New York." Grumman's revenues had tripled from $326 million in 1960 to over $1 billion in 1966, the year Leroy Grumman retired as chairman. It was the pinnacle. It was also, though no one could see it then, the high water mark. January 14th, 1969, Bethpage, New York. Grumman was selected as the winner of the Navy's VFX competition, the program to design a new carrier-based fleet defense fighter that would replace the aging F-14 Phantom II. The aircraft Grumman proposed was large, powerful, and built around a revolutionary variable geometry wing that swept forward for low-speed carrier operations and swept back for high-speed intercept missions. Following the Grumman tradition of naming aircraft after cats, the new fighter was designated the F-14 Tomcat. It would be the last cat Grumman ever built. The F-14 made its first flight on December 21, 1970. It entered operational service with the United States Navy in September 1974, embarking aboard the USS Enterprise. From that day forward, the Tomcat became the primary fleet air defense interceptor of the American carrier Navy. Its mission was specific and vital: to protect carrier battle groups from the massive Soviet bomber strikes that Cold War planners believed would constitute the opening move of any war in the North Atlantic. Armed with the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles, a Tomcat patrol could theoretically intercept Soviet bombers far beyond the horizon of any carrier it was protecting. The aircraft became something else too. In 1986, when director Tony Scott's film Top Gun premiered in American movie theaters and became the highest-grossing film of that year, the F-14 Tomcat became a cultural icon. Tom Cruise climbed into a Grumman aircraft, and suddenly every young American knew what the Bethpage Iron Works looked like from the cockpit. At its production peak in 1986, the Grumman facility employed 23,000 people on Long Island, occupying 6 million square feet of floor space across 105 acres in Bethpage. Employee headcount company-wide reached 34,000. The company posted revenues of $3.24 billion. It was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It was a Fortune 500 corporation and the largest private employer on Long Island.
A total of 712 F-14 Tomcats were ultimately built. 632 for the United States Navy, 79 for the Imperial Iranian Air Force. The Bethpage factory was not merely a building producing aircraft. It was the economic heart of an entire region, the backbone of a community, and the reason that nearly every family on Long Island had at least one member who had worked inside its walls. Then the Soviet Union began to collapse. 1965, Bethpage, New York. To understand what Grumman meant to Long Island, you have to understand that it was never simply an employer. It was a civic institution with wings. Leroy Grumman had insisted from the very beginning that the company would hire locally, pay fairly, and invest in the communities around it. He believed, and the evidence of his career bears this out, that a workforce treated with dignity and respect would outperform a workforce driven by fear and insecurity. He was correct. The company offered profit-sharing plans at a time when most American manufacturers had never heard of the concept. It built recreational facilities. It maintained an open-door policy that allowed workers to bring concerns directly to management. Its workforce remained non-union, not because workers were prevented from organizing, but because the conditions at Grumman made union representation feel unnecessary. In an era of labor strife across American industry, the Bethpage plant ran with exceptional labor peace. Grumman donated land for the Bethpage Community Park in 1962, 18 acres purchased for $720,000 and given to the public. When the local fire district needed a new substation north of the railroad tracks in 1956, Grumman donated the land for that too. The children's baseball leagues of Bethpage all carried the names of Grumman Aircraft. Stewart Avenue and Central Avenue were widened to accommodate the rush-hour traffic generated by Grumman's workforce. The economic growth of Nassau County in the 1950s and 60s is inseparable from the growth of Grumman. When a Dallas-based conglomerate called LTV Corporation launched a hostile takeover bid for Grumman in 1981, the community response was something rarely seen in American business history. Workers wore T-shirts declaring, "I love Grumman," and "LTV stay away, Grumman all the way." There were bumper stickers, newspaper advertisements, banners in shop windows, letters flooding into Washington. Leroy Grumman himself, by then in his late 80s, his eyesight failing from diabetes, publicly supported the resistance. A United States Court of Appeals eventually rejected LTV's bid on antitrust grounds. Long Island had defended its factory. Leroy Grumman died in October 1982, the year after the attempted takeover was defeated. He did not live to see what came next, but the warnings were already visible to anyone paying close attention. Defense budgets were cyclical. Cold wars did not last forever, and a company whose entire identity was built around a single customer, the United States Navy, was exposed in ways that the prosperity of the 1960s and 70s had obscured. 1986, Bethpage, New York. The same year Grumman reached the peak of its Cold War employment, 23,000 workers on Long Island. A monitoring well drilled near the factory site detected something alarming in the groundwater below Bethpage: chemical contamination. The compounds were volatile organic chemicals associated with aircraft manufacturing, degreasing solvents, hydraulic fluids, cleaning agents that had been used in the production of aircraft for decades, and that had been disposed of, in many cases, by simply pouring them into unlined pits behind the factory buildings. The contamination had actually begun decades earlier. Water district officials had first detected elevated nickel and chromium concentrations in soil near the Grumman facility as far back as 1938, 8 years after the company opened. But the full scope of what had been accumulating beneath the ground was not understood for another half-century. By the time the first formal discovery was made in 1986, the contamination had already travelled. It would eventually be mapped as a plume 4.3 miles long, 2.1 miles wide, and as much as 900 feet deep, stretching beneath Bethpage and spreading outward toward Plainedge, South Farmingdale, North Massapequa, and parts of Levittown, Seaford, Wantor, and Massapequa Park. More than 1,000 current and former residents of the affected area would eventually join class action and personal injury lawsuits alleging health consequences from the pollution. Sandra D'Arcangelo, a 40-year Bethpage resident who sat on a Navy Community Advisory Board, would later say publicly that she found it almost impossible to accept that a company capable of putting a man on the moon proved so completely ineffective at preventing the poisoning of its own community's drinking water. The contamination would not become a matter of wide public knowledge for years. The company minimized it. State officials minimized it. The slow-moving nature of groundwater contamination meant that evidence of harm accumulated across decades, rather than appearing in a single dramatic event. But the plume was growing. It was spreading. And the community that had cheered for Grumman, that had rallied to save it from LTV, that had named its baseball teams after Grumman Aircraft, was drinking water that had passed through the factory's shadow. Meanwhile, the geopolitical event that would end Grumman's independence was already beginning to unfold. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. November 9, 1989, Berlin, Germany. When the first sections of the Berlin Wall came down and jubilant crowds streamed through the gaps, the Cold War that had sustained American defense spending for 4 decades began its rapid dissolution. The Soviet Union, the threat that had justified the F-14 Tomcat, the E-2 Hawkeye, the EA-6B Prowler, and a dozen other Grumman aircraft, was disintegrating. By December 1991, it was formally dissolved. The collapse of the Soviet Union cascaded through the American defense industry with the force of an economic earthquake. Pentagon budgets that had been calibrated against the threat of massive Soviet bomber strikes and submarine warfare had no institutional framework for a world without that threat. Congress responded to public pressure for a peace dividend by cutting defense appropriations. Procurement contracts were cancelled, delayed, or reduced in scope. Companies that had grown to enormous size serving a single customer, the United States government, found themselves suddenly oversupplied in capacity and undersupported in revenue. For Grumman, the damage was direct and irreversible. The Navy cancelled the program that would have replaced the F-14, citing cost overruns and budget constraints. Grumman proposed ambitious upgrade packages, the Super Tomcat 21 and other variants, that would have extended the F-14's viability well into the 21st century. The Navy rejected every proposal. The aircraft was too expensive to maintain. Its variable geometry wing mechanism required extraordinary amounts of maintenance labor per flight hour. In the post-Cold War budget environment, the simpler and cheaper Boeing FA-18 Super Hornet won the argument that the Tomcat could not. Grumman's headcount, which had peaked at 34,000 company-wide in 1988, began its decline. By early 1994, it stood at 17,900. The company announced it would close 5 manufacturing facilities on Long Island, including the Calverton testing and final assembly plant. The plan was projected to save $600 million over 5 years. It was not enough. The company that had survived the end of World War II, the Korean conflict, the transition to jets, and the attempted LTV takeover could not survive the end of the Cold War. Not as an independent entity, not intact.
Something was coming that no t-shirt slogan and no court of appeals could stop. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything to a channel like this. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happens in the next chapter. Early 1994, Bethpage, New York. The news reached Long Island in the way that catastrophic news tends to arrive. Not all at once, but in layers. First came reports that Grumman was in merger discussions. Then came confirmation. Then came the bidding war, which unfolded with the cold efficiency of financial calculation applied to 6 decades of human achievement. 2 companies wanted Grumman. The first was Martin Marietta Corporation, which offered $1.9 billion. The second was the Northrop Corporation, a California-based aerospace manufacturer with long ties to the United States Air Force but limited presence in Navy programs. Northrop's bid was $2.1 billion, $200 million more. The Northrop offer prevailed. On April 4, 1994, Grumman Corporation ceased to exist as an independent company. It became Northrop Grumman. The transaction was completed with the financial precision of a corporate acquisition and the emotional weight of a funeral. Long Islanders were stunned. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about the end of Grumman that read more like obituaries than business reports. New York Senator-in-Waiting Kirsten Gillibrand, then a Democratic advocate for upstate and Long Island economic interests, expressed frustration that one of the state's crown jewel employers was being absorbed by a California company with no apparent commitment to maintaining its Long Island presence. Her frustration was well-founded. Northrop Grumman moved rapidly to consolidate and rationalize. Manufacturing operations that remained on Long Island were wound down and transferred to facilities in Florida and Louisiana, where labor and real estate costs were dramatically lower. The enormous Calverton facility, 6,000 acres on which the Navy's most advanced carrier aircraft had been tested and prepared for service, was converted into a business and industrial complex. Former aircraft hangars became Grumman Studios, a film and television production facility. The Bethpage headquarters building at 1111 Stewart Avenue, the nerve center from which Grumman had managed its journey from naval biplane manufacturer to Apollo spacecraft builder, became the corporate headquarters of Cablevision, the cable television company. The factory that had built the machine that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon became an office park. What had employed 23,000 people in 1986 employed fewer than 500 by the early 2000s. The Iron Works had gone cold. September 22, 2006. Oceana Naval Air Station, Virginia. The last active-duty Grumman F-14 Tomcat completed its final flight and was retired from the United States Navy service. 32 years after first embarking aboard a carrier, the aircraft that had defined American naval air power through the Cold War was officially finished. It had never been defeated in aerial combat. It had never been replaced by something clearly superior in its specific mission. It was retired because maintaining it cost too much money in a world where the threat it was built to counter no longer existed. The Navy's handling of the retirement revealed something about the specific nature of the threat the Tomcat represented, even after its operational life ended. Because the aircraft had been sold to Iran before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and because Iran retained a fleet of F-14s, however diminished and difficult to maintain, American intelligence officials were acutely concerned that retired Navy Tomcats could become a source of spare parts for the Iranian fleet. In response to this concern, the Department of Defense ordered that all F-14 airframes stored at the Arizona Aircraft Boneyard, the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, be destroyed. Not mothballed, destroyed. The aircraft were cut apart with industrial equipment, their components crushed and rendered unusable.
A handful of Tomcats survive in museums around the country. Every other American F-14 was reduced to scrap. The Navy went so far as to destroy all remaining spare parts to ensure that none could reach Iranian hands. It is difficult to imagine a less fitting end for the aircraft that defined a generation of American naval aviation. Meanwhile, in Iran, the surviving F-14s have continued to deteriorate. Without access to manufacturer support, without replacement parts, cannibalizing grounded airframes to keep a dwindling number flying, the Iranian Tomcat fleet has been reduced to a handful of barely operational machines. When American and Israeli operations struck Iranian air defense infrastructure in 2025, several F-14 airframes were reportedly destroyed. The last cats are dying slowly in a Persian desert, far from the factory floors in Bethpage that built them. Back on Long Island, the building where the Tomcat's wings were designed had been converted into studio space for television productions. The silence was total. 2011, Bethpage, New York. Denise Iannuzzi Florio had moved to Bethpage from Queens in 2003. She had moved precisely because Bethpage was quiet, family-oriented, the kind of suburban Long Island neighborhood where children played in community parks and life felt manageable. 8 years after her move, her suburban peace ended with a breast cancer diagnosis. She was not alone. By the early 2010s, the scale of health concerns among Bethpage residents had become impossible to ignore. Clusters of cancer diagnoses, unusually high rates of illness in communities whose residents drank from wells drawing water from the same aquifer system that flowed beneath the former Grumman factory site. More than 1,000 current and former residents joined class action or personal injury suits against Northrop Grumman and the United States Navy, which, as the landholder of the Naval Weapons Industrial Reserve Plant, bore shared legal responsibility for the contamination. The toxic plume that had been first identified in 1986 had continued to grow while the legal arguments about responsibility and remediation moved at the pace of government bureaucracy. By the time detailed mapping was completed, the contamination stretched 4.3 miles long, 2.1 miles wide, and descended as far as 900 feet into the earth. A three-dimensional shadow cast by decades of industrial production over communities that had loved Grumman, cheered for it, named their children's baseball teams after its aircraft. A state remediation plan eventually projected costs of $585 million. Monitoring wells drilled near Hempstead Turnpike detected trichloroethylene, a known carcinogen, at levels as high as 4,600 parts per billion in groundwater hundreds of feet below the surface. The legally established safe limit for trichloroethylene in drinking water is 5 parts per billion. The company that had received the Navy's Production Excellence Award 5 consecutive times. The company that had built the machine that carried astronauts to the moon. The company that Long Island had rallied to save from a hostile takeover. That company had left a 4.3-mile-long chemical shadow beneath the homes of the people who had cheered for it. Gene O'Connor, founder of the Bethpage Massapequa Plume Coalition, had heard rumblings about water contamination as early as the late 1970s. Nobody in authority had taken it seriously. Now her neighbors were sick. 2009, Bethpage, New York. Parviz Farazad opened Grumman Studios in the converted aircraft hangars adjacent to the former Bethpage factory site. Film and television crews moved into buildings where 6 decades earlier a different kind of production had taken place. One measured not in takes and edits, but in aluminum alloy and machined titanium. The Grumman name, which had been inseparable from Long Island identity for 60 years, now appeared above a facility used to film commercials and television dramas. The Bethpage Business Park occupied what had been one of the largest privately operated aerospace manufacturing complexes in the world. Office workers navigated corridors that still carried the proportions of factory infrastructure. Ceilings too high, doors too wide, spaces designed for industrial equipment rather than cubicles and conference rooms. Some walls still bore faded markings from their original purpose: load-bearing designations, warning labels, directional indicators for production traffic. At the Cradle of Aviation Museum on nearby Charles Lindbergh Boulevard in Garden City, a lunar module test article sits in a room designed to evoke the surface of the Moon, complete with simulated stars and a representation of the Earth as it appeared to Neil Armstrong from the lunar surface. Thousands of schoolchildren visit every year and stand beneath the machine that was built a few miles away in a town most of them live in. The Grumman Memorial Park at Calverton preserves several Grumman aircraft on outdoor display, including an F-14 Tomcat. Veterans who once flew those aircraft or maintained them come to stand next to them and remember. The park exists because enough people understood that without deliberate preservation, the evidence of what was built here would vanish entirely. Northrop Grumman maintains some office presence in Bethpage, a vestige of what was once the headquarters of one of America's most consequential industrial enterprises. A plaque in Building 25 at 600 Grumman Road West marks the site where the lunar module engineering was executed, designated a milestone by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. On the Moon's surface, 6 descent stages rest in the silence of the Sea of Tranquility and 5 other landing sites. Each one carries the stamp of a factory that no longer exists in any meaningful form. Each nameplate still reads, "Made in Bethpage, New York." The machines outlasted the factory. The work outlasted the company. The silence came last. Walk through the former Grumman property in Bethpage today, and the scale of what once existed here reveals itself in the proportions of the buildings that remain. Ceilings that soar to heights designed for aircraft assembly, not office work. Floors with reinforced concrete capable of bearing the weight of partially assembled naval fighters. Spaces so vast that the human figure becomes small against them in the same way it once became small against the work being done inside. If you visit the Cradle of Aviation Museum or stand at Grumman Memorial Park on a quiet afternoon, you can feel the gap between what this place was and what it has become. 3 truths emerge from the Grumman story that outlast the specific details of any single contract or aircraft program. The first is about the danger of building an empire around a single customer. Grumman was the Navy's ironworks in the most literal sense, designed, organized, and optimized around the specific requirements of a single branch of a single government. When that customer's priorities changed, Grumman had no alternative market deep enough to absorb the loss. The Gulfstream business jets and the long-life vehicle postal trucks were genuine diversifications, but they were sideshows compared to the main event. A company whose survival depends entirely on the appetite of one buyer is not a company. It is a dependency, and dependencies end when the need ends. The second truth is about the hidden cost of industrial production. The Grumman factory did not merely consume raw materials and produce aircraft. It consumed the groundwater beneath an entire community and left behind a chemical legacy that its workers, their neighbors, and their children would spend decades paying for in ways that no quarterly earnings report ever captured. The lesson is not that manufacturing is inherently destructive. It is that the full cost of production must be measured honestly, including the costs that do not appear on the balance sheet until decades after the production lines fall silent. The third truth is about what communities sacrifice for their economic anchors. Long Island gave Grumman 65 years of loyalty, labor, community support, and political protection. In return, it received employment, prosperity, and a connection to some of the greatest technological achievements in human history. It also received a toxic plume 4 miles long. The bargain is complicated. From 1930 to 1994, from a broken-down garage in Baldwin to a $2.1 billion acquisition, from the F-4F Wildcat to the Moon and back, 23,000 workers at peak, 6 landing stages still resting on the lunar surface. What remains in Bethpage is the memory of an empire that touched the stars and left its shadow in the earth below.
The Grumman Iron Works is silent. The moon is not.